Okay, so I've looked at derived demand, factors affecting demand, factors that influence supply, and geographical occupational mobility. In terms of the labour market equilibrium and understanding current issues, two ways to look at the equilibrium. You've got kind of wage determination in terms of the price mechanism. So if there was a disequilibrium and for whatever reason the wages were above the market equilibrium wage, then you would have an excess of supply in the market. So there'd be too many workers, a shortage of demand because they wouldn't be willing to work. So there'd be a level of unemployment within the market that would lead to wages falling until it reaches an equilibrium. The other way to analyse it would just be with supply and demand and any of those factors that we just looked at previously. So for example, derived demand and how that affects the quantity of workers and the wages in a competitive market. An uncompetitive market, and it may be something like the monopoly power of the government in determining wages in the NHS. This isn't a graph in the spec, so if the kind of the basic analysis would be that the wages will be lower and the quantity employed would be lower than the socio-optimum level. So that's your loss of allocative efficiency. To show that on a graph, so this is, again, if you haven't memorized this one already, maybe it's not a one to memorize now, but you've got the marginal cost, you've got the supply of workers, and you've got the marginal revenue product. In this market, the socially optimum wage and quantity are at that level, but the profit maximizing in terms of marginal cost equals marginal revenue is at this point, and this is the wage that the business are paying. So it's at a lower quantity and a lower wage. What this last equilibrium is, that's the marginal revenue product. So this is what the business should be paying the workers at that quantity, not at the social optimum quantity. So what this area represents is the kind of extra benefit the business is getting from paying at that lower point in terms to what that labour is adding. So they're charging that, but the labour is adding that to the business. But the two main equilibriums, you don't really need that part, is that one and that one, in terms of this is the social optimum, but this is the free market under a monopoly. So they're paying lower wages and there's less workers being employed. So there's a loss of allocative efficiency in that market. In terms of current issues in the labour market, we've mentioned kind of the changes in participation and how these could increase the supply of workers. You have, in recent times, a significant amount of underemployment or part-time kind of temporary employment. We do have a significantly low unemployment level in comparison to other countries, but a lot of those jobs are kind of in lower skilled jobs from people who have higher skilled potential. So they could take a higher skilled job, or they are working part-time when they'd like to work full-time. So what that means is for those individuals, their utility is lower because they are effectively getting lower wages than they would get if they were employed full-time in skilled work that they're trained for. But it hugely benefits the business in terms of it reduces their average costs, as they are able to take advantage of workers when they demand them and also pay them less because of that. That also links into kind of those 0 hours contracts, which again fall very heavily in terms of business benefits. No guarantee of work, but you can't work for someone else because you've got a contract to work for them. And also kind of some issues around in the EU, but also within the UK, that youth unemployment and skills within young people are a problem. As a percentage, it's greater than other levels of unemployment across the country. So in terms of government policy, there's a lot of government policy around that. And in fact, the reason that the national minimum wage, or one of the reasons why the national minimum wage is lower for young people, is to try and encourage businesses to take those on in relation to a higher paid older person. Okay, so what we went through today in the revision session was the labour market section of the specification, looking at demand for labour, supply for labour, and wage determination in competitive and non-competitive markets. Some of it around demand for labour and supply for labour looks at kind of efficient markets, the price mechanism working to set wages. You then have some market failure in labour markets. You've got labour market equilibrium, so wage determination. You've got some current labour market issues, government intervention in the labour market, so specifically maximum minimum wages, public sector wage setting, so the government acting as a monopsony in several sectors, education, the NHS, and so on. Policies to tackle labour market immobility, so example of subsidies there or regulation, and the significance of elasticity of demand for labour and elasticity of supply. So looking first at the factors that influence demand for labour. The key first part in terms of demand is that labour is a derived demand, so it's caused by the demand for goods and services. And just as an example of this, so as the economy grows, incomes would rise, and for normal goods and services, the demand for these would rise, which would create a demand for whatever labour would produce that goods or service. So for example, if it was cars, you'd end up with an increase in demand for engineers. So the derived demand being one of the key things that affects the demand for labour. The other two can come from the effect of changes to wages. Now, in terms of the supply and demand of labour, in its determination of wages, an increase in the supply, for example from immigration, would reduce the wages, and then that reduction in wages would allow businesses to employ more, so there would be an extension in demand. So the derived demand itself would cause a shift in demand, but lower wages would allow a business to increase the demand along the demand line. The last one, which can have the same effect as a fall in wages, although wages don't change, so they stay the same, would be an increase in productivity. And an increase in productivity would increase the output per worker, so with the same wages the business would be able to produce more. What that effectively does is it increases the substitution, or the strength of the substitution between labour and capital. And in that situation, the demand for labour would go up, because as they are more productive, the business can afford to employ more of them, and that would be another factor that would increase demand. In terms of elasticity, so especially inelastic demand, time is a key factor. So in the short term, businesses are going to be unresponsive to changes in wages. So if wages rise for whatever reason, then businesses would only reduce the numbers by a few. It could also be a lack of close substitutive capital, so physical capital, which would allow a substitution to that. And it might also be a lack of the substitutes of other forms of labour. In terms of the supply of labour, so again, anything that would increase or decrease the supply, causing a shift in supply inward or outward. Immigration or migration. So immigration would cause a shift to the right, emigration would cause a shift to the left. The participation of various groups, and some of the significant ones in recent times are an increase in women in the labour force, but also a rise in the retirement age, which has also had the effect of increasing participation and increasing supply. In specific markets, the education and skill level of people. So increases in education or increases in spending can increase supply in specific markets. The other factors that link into participation, but come more from kind of incentives, and this is kind of the economic right or Hayek kind of point of view of the free market. So things like changes to income tax would make people more likely to enter the market if those are reduced. A reduction in trade union powers would allow businesses to make workers more flexible, again increasing supply. Deregulation of labour markets also having the same effect, and potentially reductions in benefits, so kind of supply side policies linked to those, but again how they impact on supply. In terms of supply as well, you have the kind of issues around immobility. So a mobile workforce would allow supply to and the price mechanism to reach an equilibrium, but the immobility might lead to a disequilibrium in markets or a kind of a market failure. And that will mean there'll be a loss of allocative efficiency, as wages would be too high and supply too low in some markets, but too high and too low in other markets. The two main ones are kind of geographical immobility, so people staying in the northeast when the jobs are in London. And this can be for reasons such as family or the cost of living in London. In terms of occupational immobility, this tends to be linked to structural unemployment or technological unemployment, so people losing their jobs because they've lost skills and they're not able to take another job in another section because they're just lacking the skills. So we've kind of looked at the diagrams really briefly, we've looked at some of the issues. We've got a few left in terms of our policies to analyse here as well, and we'll just look at a little bit at the kind of the elasticity of supply around that. So okay, so we'll look at government intervention really quickly. In terms of the monopsony or lower wages, the assumption is that kind of wages are lower than the socio-optimum. Then the national minimum wage is the potential solution to that. So it's above the market equilibrium, or the current market equilibrium. But the analysis is that this would lead to the supply of workers being greater than the demand, which will lead to unemployment between Q and Q1, mainly from the reduction in workers here, but also the government failure of more workers making themselves available in this market. Now, there is a benefit in theory for the workers that have managed to keep their jobs and that they are getting paid at a higher wage rate. The way to evaluate this is what the national minimum wage might be in relation to the socio-optimum wage. If it is greater than, then this in theory causes unemployment. However, you could argue that because we haven't seen this happen in the UK, that actually the national minimum wage is less than the socio-optimum wage, which means there isn't any unemployment. And the reason that that's happened is because there's other failures within the labour market. So it could be monopsonies, but it could be information failures. It could be the lack of trade union power in terms of a lack of bargaining. So that would be one government intervention. Another less obvious one, but it came up in a question before, would just be a maximum wage. And this would potentially be for very highly skilled people, or people on high incomes, footballers, the like, and that would be kind of about trying to solve inequality. So maximum wage would kind of prevent wages rising above an amount to kind of stop vast pay differentials. The success of some of these depends upon kind of the elasticity of demand and supply. So a national minimum wage that's effective may imply that demand is inelastic. So businesses aren't able to change, so they kind of may only affect the employment in a very small amount. So if you're kind of thinking of a valuation for national minimum wage, one of them could be about the elasticity and saying that depends upon the elasticity of demand. If it's inelastic in the short term, there might be less of an impact on job losses. In terms of supply of workers, it tends to be that supply is more elastic in unskilled professions. So in terms of the national minimum wage going up, in the effect of that oversupply, it might be that if elasticity of supply is elastic, then this might lead to larger impacts in terms of misallocation of resources. The other government interventions tend to be around the mobility of labour. So one example that we looked at was kind of, especially for the southeast, subsidies for housing. In terms of occupational, it tends to be training, but you still have the weaknesses of subsidies, so that they could lead to government failures because you are subsidising inefficient firms, and specifically productively inefficient. So in that situation, you'd be wasting government money. It could also be that the demand for whatever it is inelastic, so actually you don't get the significant amount of workers that you wanted to in terms of that subsidy. In terms of training, it could be that if the person has been structurally unemployed for a period of time, even with the skills, people might not take them on. They may just think there's something wrong with that person. Also, it could be that if it is the government that's doing it, will there be the skills that are needed? Some people would argue that if it's businesses doing the training, that they are much more likely to train people for the specific skills they need, rather than a government approach of putting people on courses and then creating skills that might not be needed at the end of it. You also just have the general government failures that go along with any government intervention. One being information failure. So do they really know the right reasons why people aren't moving to the southeast? Do they really know what specific skills are needed? But you also have kind of regulatory capture. If you're looking at government interventions like the national minimum wage or kind of trade union bargaining, or kind of regulation in general. So businesses will try to argue for less regulation, a lower minimum wage, less trade union power and less regulation, which might bring down wages further or still not achieve social optimum. So kind of a really good way to evaluate any government intervention is that it makes the situation a little bit better, but it still doesn't achieve the socio-optimum level of employment and wages.